The dust swirled across the scorched Wyoming Territory earth as Florence Parker stared at the charred remains of her father's ranch house, the last wisps of smoke curling into the endless blue sky of 1877. Her entire life gone in a single night of flame and terror. 22 years of memories reduced to ash and blackened timber. 3 days of walking had brought her to Whispering Creek, a small but growing settlement where she knew no one and had nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's pocket watch. Florence moved toward the bustling Main Street, her once fine dress now tattered and smudged with soot and trail dust. Her auburn hair hung limp around her face, escaping from what had once been a neat bun. She could feel the stares of the townspeople, some curious, some pitying, some suspicious. A woman alone in these parts was either looking for trouble or running from it. "Excuse me, miss," a shopkeeper called as she passed. "You look like you could use some help." Florence paused, pride warring with desperation. "I need work," she said simply, "and a place to stay." The shopkeeper's gaze traveled over her disheveled appearance, and his expression shifted from concern to wariness. "Can't help you, miss. Try the saloon. They might have positions." Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She knew exactly what kind of positions he meant. Her father had raised her better than that. Florence lifted her chin and continued walking, though each step felt heavier than the last. By nightfall, Florence had visited every respectable establishment in Whispering Creek. The general store, the dressmaker's shop, the schoolhouse, even the undertaker, none were hiring, at least not a bedraggled young woman with no references and no connections. Her stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten since the previous day, and even then it had only been a handful of berries found along the trail. The Silver Dollar Saloon glowed with light and noise at the end of the street. Florence stood outside, watching shadows move behind the windows, hearing the tinny piano and raucous laughter. A tear slipped down her cheek as she realized she had no other options. "What's a lady like you doing outside a place like this?" a deep voice asked from behind her. Florence turned to find herself face to face with a tall man leading a chestnut horse. He wore dusty trail clothes, a well-worn hat pulled low over his eyes, and a gun belt that had clearly seen use. A cowboy, by the look of him, perhaps returning from a cattle drive. "I'm not." She began, but her voice caught. "I don't know where else to go." The man stepped closer, and in the light spilling from the saloon windows, she could see his face more clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with intelligent blue eyes and a strong jawline shadowed with several days' growth of beard. "Isaac Zimmerman," he said, tipping his hat. "Just rode in with a herd from the Double Cross Ranch." "Florence Parker," she replied automatically, her mother's lessons in manners holding fast despite everything. "You look like you've had a rough time of it, Miss Parker," Isaac observed, his voice gentle. "When's the last time you ate?" Florence tried to answer, but suddenly her vision swam and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She swayed, and in an instant, Isaac's strong hands were steadying her. "Whoa there," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Let's get you somewhere you can sit down." Before she could protest, he had guided her to a bench outside the general store. He rummaged in his saddlebag and produced a strip of jerky and a canteen. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's better than nothing." Florence wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity she had left, but hunger won out. She took the jerky with trembling fingers and bit into it, the salty flavor flooding her mouth. "Thank you," she managed between bites. Isaac sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "What happened to you, if you don't mind my asking?" Florence stared at the ground. "Raiders," she said simply. "They came at night, burned our ranch, my father—" Her voice broke. He didn't make it out. Isaac was silent for a long moment. "I'm real sorry to hear that," he finally said, and the genuine compassion in his voice nearly undid her. "I've been to every business in town," she continued, needing to explain her desperate situation. "No one will hire me. I have nowhere to go." "The Double Cross is looking for a cook," Isaac said thoughtfully. Old Pete just up and quit last week, claimed his rheumatism couldn't take another Wyoming winter. Hope flared briefly in Florence's chest, then died. I don't know the first thing about cooking for a ranch full of cowboys. Isaac smiled slightly. Can you make biscuits? Yes, beans, of course. Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. A reluctant smile tugged at Florence's lips. My father said mine could wake the dead. Then you're already more qualified than half the trail cooks I've known, Isaac said. Mr. Rollins, he's the foreman, is a fair man. He might give you a chance, especially if I put in a good word. Florence looked at him suspiciously. Why would you do that for a stranger? Isaac's expression grew serious. Because my sister was in a spot similar to yours once. Someone helped her when she needed it most. I'm just passing along the favor. He stood and offered his hand. What do you say? It's a decent wage, a roof over your head, and honest work. Florence hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Isaac, he corrected with a smile. We're not much for formalities at the Double Cross. The Double Cross Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of Wyoming Territory, with the main house and bunkhouse nestled in a valley protected from the worst of the winds. Florence rode behind Isaac on his horse, her arms tentatively wrapped around his waist. Despite her exhaustion, she couldn't help noticing the solid strength of him, the clean scent of his duster despite days on the trail. As they approached, lanterns glowed in the windows of the main house, and smoke curled from the chimney. Isaac helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Wait here, he said, tying his horse to the hitching post. I'll speak to Mr. Rollins. Florence stood alone in the yard, shivering slightly in the night air. She could hear voices from inside Isaac's deep rumble and another man's gruffer tones. After what seemed an eternity, the door opened, and Isaac beckoned her inside. The ranch house was warm and surprisingly clean, with a large stone fireplace and solid wooden furniture. A man with iron-gray hair and a weather-beaten face stood by the fire, assessing her with keen eyes. Miss Parker, he said, nodding slightly. Zimmerman here tells me you're looking for work and that you can cook. Yes, sir, Florence said, straightening her spine despite her fatigue. I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work. Good, because there's plenty of both here, Rollins replied. I'll give you a week's trial. You mess up, you're out. You do well, the job's yours permanently. Fair enough. More than fair, Mr. Rollins, thank you. The foreman grunted. There's a small cabin behind the cookhouse. Used to belong to old Pete. It's yours while you're here. Zimmerman will show you. Thank you, sir, Florence said again, relief washing over her. Isaac led her to a small but sturdy log cabin a short distance from the main house. Inside was a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove for heat. It's not much, Isaac said, lighting a lamp, but it's yours and you can lock the door. No one will bother you here. Florence looked around the simple space, her eyes filling with tears. After days of uncertainty and fear, the thought of a safe place to sleep was overwhelming. It's perfect, she whispered, her voice catching. Isaac shifted uncomfortably. There's some of Mrs. Rollins' old clothes in the chest. She said you're welcome to them until you can get into town. The cookhouse is stocked. Breakfast is at 5 sharp. He moved toward the door, then paused. You're going to be all right, Florence Parker. After he left, Florence sat on the edge of the bed, the enormity of the past few days crashing over her. She buried her face in her hands and finally allowed herself to weep for her father, for her lost home, for the uncertain future. When the tears finally subsided, she washed her face in the basin of water Isaac had brought, changed into one of Mrs. Rollins' nightgowns, and fell into an exhausted sleep. Morning came too soon. Florence rose before dawn, dressed in borrowed clothes, and made her way to the cookhouse by lamplight. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a massive cast iron stove, bins of flour and sugar, sacks of beans and potatoes, and a smokehouse attached to the back. Florence took a deep breath and set to work. By the time the ranch hands began filing in at 5 o'clock, she had coffee brewing, biscuits baking, and a massive skillet of eggs and bacon sizzling on the stove. The men entered warily, eyeing her with curiosity. Isaac was among the last to arrive, his hair damp from washing. He gave her an encouraging nod as he took a seat at the long table. "Coffee smells good, Miss Parker," one of the older cowboys said, and the others murmured agreement. Florence served them efficiently, ignoring the occasional appraising glance. She'd learned from her father that the best way to earn respect was to do your job well and without complaint. The men ate with the hearty appetite of those who worked hard, and by the end of the meal, several had complimented her cooking. As the ranch hands dispersed to their daily tasks, Isaac lingered behind. "You did well," he said, refilling his coffee cup. "The way to a cowboy's respect is through his stomach." Florence smiled slightly as she began clearing the dishes. "My father used to say the same thing." "Smart man, your father." Isaac leaned against the door frame. "Will you be all right here today? I've got to ride out to check on some strays." "I'll be fine," Florence assured him. "I have plenty to do," and she did. After breakfast, she cleaned the cookhouse from top to bottom, took inventory of supplies, and began preparations for the midday and evening meals. The work was hard but straightforward, and it kept her mind from dwelling on her losses. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Florence found her place at the Double Cross. The cowboys accepted her presence, and she learned their names and preferences: who liked extra pepper in their eggs, who preferred their coffee black, who had a sweet tooth that could be satisfied with an extra biscuit with honey. Mr. Rowlands officially hired her after the trial week, even increasing the wage he'd initially offered. Isaac Zimmerman remained a steady presence. He wasn't always on the ranch. His job as one of the lead cowboys took him away for days at a time, but when he was there, he often found reasons to visit the cookhouse. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they worked in companionable silence. Florence found herself looking forward to his company more than she cared to admit. One evening in late October, nearly 2 months after her arrival, Florence was kneading bread dough when Isaac appeared in the doorway, a grim expression on his face. "We got trouble," he said without preamble. "Rowlands sent riders to the neighboring ranches. There's a gang of raiders working their way through the territory, same ones that hit your place, most likely." Florence's hands stilled in the dough. "How do you know?" "Same pattern. They hit isolated homesteads and small ranches after dark. Burn everything, take what they can carry." Isaac stepped closer. "Rowlands wants everyone in the main house tonight, safety in numbers." Florence nodded, trying to ignore the fear that clawed at her throat. "I'll finish here and come over." After dinner, the ranch hands gathered in the main house. Extra men were posted as sentries around the property, and rifles were distributed to those who remained. Florence sat near the fire, mending one of the shirts Mrs. Rowlands had given her, trying to keep her hands busy so they wouldn't shake. Isaac approached and sat beside her. "You all right?" "No," she admitted quietly, "but I will be." He was silent for a moment, watching her needle move through the fabric. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he finally said. "Most women who'd been through what you would have broken by now." Florence looked up, meeting his gaze. "What choice do I have? Life doesn't stop because of tragedy." "No," Isaac agreed, "it doesn't." He hesitated, then added, "My parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 16. My sister was just 12. We had to make our own way after that." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. "Where is your sister now?" "Married to a shopkeeper in Cheyenne, got 3 little ones." A smile touched his lips. "She's happy, that's all I ever wanted for her." "And what about you?" Florence asked. "What do you want?" Isaac's blue eyes held hers. "For a long time I didn't know. Just kept moving, working, surviving." His voice lowered. "Been thinking about it more lately, though." Before Florence could respond, a shout came from outside, followed by the crack of a rifle. Isaac was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his gun. "Stay here," he ordered, and then he was gone, rushing out with the other men. The night erupted into chaos. Gunshots echoed across the ranch yard, and Florence could see the orange glow of flames through the window. Her heart pounded as she remembered the night her father died. Mrs. Rowlands appeared at her side, a shotgun in her weathered hands. "Come away from the window, girl," she said firmly, "and take this." She pressed a small revolver into Florence's hand, just in case. The gun was cold and heavy, but Florence gripped it tightly, praying she wouldn't need to use it. The minutes stretched endlessly as the gunfire continued outside. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Florence stared at the door, waiting, the revolver clutched in her trembling hand. When it finally opened, Mr. Rowlands entered first, his face grim but triumphant. "We drove them off," he announced. "Managed to catch one of them, the others fled." Relief swept through Florence, only to be replaced by fresh fear when she realized Isaac wasn't among the men filing back into the house. "Where's Isaac?" she asked, unable to keep the panic from her voice. Mr. Rowlands' expression softened slightly. "Took a bullet in the shoulder." "Doc's with him in the bunkhouse." Florence didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was outside, running toward the bunkhouse, ignoring Mrs. Rowlands' calls to come back. The night air was cold on her flushed face, and the smell of smoke hung heavy around her. The bunkhouse was lit by several lanterns. On one of the narrow beds, Isaac lay still, his face pale, while the ranch's doctor, an elderly man who had once practiced medicine in Denver, bent over him. "Isaac," Florence breathed, rushing to his side. He opened his eyes at the sound of her voice, his lips curving in a weak smile. "You should see the other fellow," he joked, though his voice was strained with pain. The doctor straightened, wiping his hands on a bloody cloth. "Bullet went straight through, clean wound. He'll live, though he won't be roping cattle for a while." "Thank God," Florence whispered, sinking onto the edge of the bed. She took Isaac's hand, not caring who saw or what they might think. "The raiders?" she asked, looking between Isaac and the doctor. "Gone," Isaac confirmed. "We killed 2, captured 1. The rest ran like the cowards they are." "The one we caught confessed everything," the doctor added. "Says they've hit a dozen places in the last 6 months. Marshall's already on his way to round up the rest." Florence's grip on Isaac's hand tightened. "Were they the ones who killed my father?" Isaac's eyes held her steadily. "Yes, and they'll pay for it, Florence, I promise you that." In the days that followed, Florence divided her time between her cooking duties and caring for Isaac. His wound was healing well, but the doctor had ordered him to rest. For a man accustomed to constant activity, the confinement was almost worse than the injury. "You're a terrible patient," Florence scolded one afternoon as she changed his bandage. "If you keep trying to get up, you'll tear these stitches and be laid up even longer." Isaac captured her hand as she finished securing the fresh bandage. "I'm only terrible because I hate being useless while everyone else works." "You're not useless," Florence insisted. "You nearly died protecting this ranch, protecting me." His expression grew serious. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Florence looked away, her cheeks warming. "Why, you know why," Isaac said softly, and perhaps she did. Over the past months, something had grown between them, something neither had put into words, but that hung in the air whenever they were together. A connection, a understanding, a possibility. "I should get back to the cookhouse," Florence said, standing abruptly. "Dinner won't make itself." Isaac let her go, but his gaze followed her to the door. "Florence," he called as she reached the threshold. She turned back. "Thank you for taking care of me." She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat, and hurried back to the safety of her kitchen. Winter descended on the double cross with a vengeance. Snow blanketed the valley, and bitter winds howled around the buildings. Inside the cookhouse, Florence kept the stove burning hot, turning out hearty stews, baked beans, and loaves of fresh bread to fortify the men against the cold. By Christmas, Isaac was fully recovered and back to work, though he still favored his injured shoulder in cold weather. The marshal had made good on his promise, tracking down the remaining raiders. Justice had been served, though it couldn't bring back Florence's father or erase the memories of that terrible night. On Christmas Eve, the entire ranch gathered in the main house. Mrs. Rowlands had decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and Florence had spent days baking pies, cookies, and a massive fruit cake. Someone produced a fiddle, and the evening filled with music and laughter. Florence stood near the window, watching snow fall in the lantern light when Isaac appeared at her side. He looked different tonight. He'd trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt instead of his usual work clothes. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. Florence hesitated. "It's freezing outside. Just to the cookhouse and back," he promised. "I have something to show you." Curiosity overcame her reluctance. Florence fetched her shawl, wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, and took Isaac's arm. They stepped out into the crisp night, their breath clouding in the cold air. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they crossed the yard to the cookhouse. Inside, the space was warm from the banked fire in the stove. Isaac lit a lamp, its glow casting soft shadows across the familiar room. On the table sat a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What's this?" Florence asked, moving closer. "Merry Christmas," Isaac said simply. Florence looked up at him in surprise. "I didn't get you anything." "Wasn't expecting you to," he gestured to the package. "Go on, open it." With careful fingers, Florence untied the string and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. She opened it to find blank pages of creamy paper. "It's a journal," Isaac explained. "Thought you might want to write down some of those recipes you've been creating. Maybe even some of your thoughts." Florence ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, thank you." "There's something else," Isaac said, his voice suddenly nervous. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object and placed it on the table beside the journal. Florence gasped. It was a simple gold ring with a tiny pearl set in the center. "Isaac, I'm not good with words," he said quickly. "Never have been, but I know what I feel." He took a deep breath. "These past months, watching you rebuild your life after losing everything. You're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known, Florence Parker." Florence stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Isaac, what are you saying?" He picked up the ring, holding it between them like an offering. "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Joy and fear warred within her. "We've known each other less than 4 months, she protested weakly. "And in that time, I've learned everything I need to know about you," Isaac countered. "Your courage, your kindness, your stubborn pride." A smile touched his lips. "The way you hum when you're kneading bread, the little crease between your eyebrows when you're concentrating." Tears filled Florence's eyes. "I lost everything once. I don't know if I could bear to lose anyone again." "Life comes with no guarantees," Isaac acknowledged. "But I promise you this, as long as I'm breathing, I'll do everything in my power to make you happy, to keep you safe, to be worthy of you." A tear slipped down Florence's cheek. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of wanting something this much, of believing I could have it." Her voice dropped even lower. "Nobody wants someone as broken as me." Isaac stepped closer, lifting her chin with gentle fingers until she met his gaze. "I do," he said simply. "I want you exactly as you are, Florence Parker, the broken parts, the healing parts, and everything in between." More tears fell, but Florence was smiling now. "Yes," she said, her voice strengthening. "Yes, Isaac Zimmerman, I will marry you." His answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. With slightly trembling hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Isaac pressed his forehead to hers. "I've been wanting to do that for a very long time," he confessed. Florence laughed softly. "What took you so long, Cowboy?" They were married in the spring, when the snow had melted and wildflowers carpeted the valley. The ceremony was held on the double cross, with Mr. Rowlands officiating and the entire ranch in attendance. Isaac's sister came from Cheyenne with her family, embracing Florence with tears in her eyes. "He's been alone too long," she whispered. "Thank you for changing that." Florence wore a new dress of pale blue calico with wildflowers in her hair. Isaac could barely take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows under the vast Wyoming sky. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and they were finally alone in the small cabin that would be their home until Isaac finished building the house he'd planned, Florence stood by the window, twisting her new gold band around her finger, having second thoughts. Isaac asked, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Florence turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had changed her life in so many ways. "Not one," she assured him. "I was just thinking about my father. He would have liked you." "I wish I could have met him," Isaac said sincerely. "He always told me that even in the darkest times, there's light to be found if you're brave enough to look for it." Florence laid her hand against Isaac's cheek. "You were my light, Isaac. When everything was darkness and despair, you showed me there could be a future worth living for." Isaac turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "And you were mine, Florence. I just didn't know I was searching until I found you." As spring turned to summer, Florence and Isaac settled into married life. The new house took shape on a rise overlooking the ranch, a sturdy two-story structure with plenty of room for the family they both hoped to have. Florence continued cooking for the ranch, though now with the help of a young woman from town, allowing her more time to tend to her own household. In July, Florence received news that brought both joy and a touch of bittersweet sadness. She was expecting a child. When she told Isaac, his face lit with such happiness that she couldn't help but laugh as he swept her into his arms, spinning her around their kitchen. "Careful," she protested through her giggles. "I'm in a delicate condition, or so Mrs. Rollins tells me." Isaac set her down gently, his hands lingering protectively at her waist. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." His expression grew serious. "Are you happy, Florence, truly?" Florence thought about the journey that had brought her here, the terrible loss, the desperate days, the slow rebuilding of her life. She thought about the man before her, who had seen her at her lowest and believed in her strength even when she doubted it herself. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. Their son was born the following February, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him Thomas, after Florence's father. On a clear spring morning, when Thomas was 3 months old, Florence carried him outside to show him the wildflowers blooming across the valley. Isaac found them there, Florence sitting on the porch steps of their new home, the baby cradled in her arms. "My two favorite people," he said, settling beside them and draping his arm around Florence's shoulders. Florence leaned into his embrace, contentment filling her heart. "Do you remember what I said to you that night in the cookhouse?" she asked. "When you proposed?" Isaac's fingers traced gentle patterns on her shoulder. "You said nobody would want someone as broken as you, and you said—" "I do," Isaac finished, his voice soft with emotion. "Best 2 words I ever spoke." Florence turned her face up to his, love shining in her eyes. "Thank you for proving me wrong, Cowboy." Isaac's answering kiss was a promise of love that had healed past wounds, of a present filled with joy, and of a future they would build together, one day at a time, in this wild and beautiful land they called home.